Charlotte Doyle, Chapter 15. 2 bells into the morning of our 45th day, the storm struck. All hands! All hands! Even as the cry came, the Seahawk pitched and yawed violently. Whether I got out of my hammock on my own or was tossed by the wrenching motion of the ship, to this day I do not know. But I woke to find myself sprawling on the floor, the curtain torn asunder, the forecastle in wildest confusion. Above my head, the lantern swung grotesquely. The men's possessions skittered about like billiard balls. Trunks rolled helter-skelter. The watch was scrambling up. As the ship plunged and plunged again, the cry, "All hands! All hands!" came repeatedly, more urgent than I'd ever heard it. "Hurricane!" I heard as well. There was a frantic dash out of the forecastle and to the deck. I followed, too, trying to pull on my jacket as I ran against the violent pitching of the ship. Though long past dawn, the sky was still dark. A heavy rain, flung wildly by wind that screamed and moaned like an army in mortal agony, beat upon the deck in rhythms only as a mad drummer could concoct. The sea hurled towering wall upon towering wall of foaming fury over us. One such tossed me like some drop of dew across the deck, where I fortunately crashed against a wall. As I lay stunned and bruised, gasping for breath, I caught sight of Mr. Hollybrass and Captain Jaggery in the midst of a furious dispute. "No profit to be found at the bottom of the sea," I heard the first mate cry above the storm. "Mr. Hollybrass, we sail through," the captain returned, breaking away to shout. "All hands aloft! All hands aloft!" I could hardly believe my ears. To go up into the rigging in this? But when I looked skyward, I could see the reason why. Under the brutal force of the wind, many of the sails had pulled free from their running ropes and were now tearing and snapping out of control, pulling themselves into wild whips. "All hands aloft! All hands aloft!" came the cry again. It was pleading and desperate. I could see the men bent far over to buck wind and rain, struggling toward the shrouds. I pulled myself to my feet, only to be knocked down by still another wave. Again I staggered up, grasping a rope, managing to hold on with the strength of my 2 hands. Now I was able to stand, but just barely. Slowly I made my way toward the forward mast. When I reached it, it seemed to take forever. Captain Jaggery was already there, trying frantically to lash down ropes and rigging. "What shall I do?" I shouted to his back. Shouting was the only way I could make myself heard. "Cut away the foreyard before it pulls the mast down," he yelled back. I'm not certain he realized it was me. "Do you have a knife?" he called. No. Even as he reached into a back pocket, he turned, and when he saw it was me, he hesitated. "A knife!" I cried. He handed one to me. "Where?" I called. "Didn't you hear me?" he cried, gesticulating wildly. "Cut that sail away!" I looked up, and I could not see far into the sheets of rain. The Seahawk's wild pitching had set the mast to shaking as if it had palsy. Only the foreyard was visible, and the sail was blowing from almost into the shape of a balloon. Suddenly the sail collapsed into itself and then filled again. It would burst soon or fly off with the mast. "Up, damn you! Hurry!" Captain Jaggery screamed. I reached into the rigging, but stopped, realizing I couldn't climb and hold the knife. With the blade between my teeth, I again grasped the rigging, and using both hands, I began to climb. Though I was in fact climbing into the air, I felt as though I was swimming against a rising river tide. But more than rain or waves, it was the screaming wind that tore at me. I could hardly make out where I was going, and to make matters worse, my wet and heavy hair, like a horse's tail, kept whipping across my face. I might have been blindfolded. Desperate, I wrapped my legs and one arm around the ropes. With one arm free, I pulled my hair around and grasped it with the hand entwined in the ropes, and I pulled it taut. So imagine I have long hair. She's pulling it around like this, holding on to the rope, holding on to the knife. Here's her hair, here's the knife. I took the knife and hacked. With a shake of my head, my 13 years' growth of hair fell away. Feeling much lighter, I bit down onto the blade again, and I once more began to climb. Every upward inch was a struggle, as though I were forcing myself between the fingers of God's angry fist. And it was not just the elements that attacked. Below me, when I dared to look, the deck blurred into a confusing mass of water, foam, decking, and now and again a struggling man. I was certain the Seahawk would flounder, that we were doomed to drown. I told myself not to look, to concentrate on what I had to do. Up I went. The rain hissed, thunder boomed, lightning cracked. Human cries came too, shouts that rose through the maelstrom. Words I couldn't catch, but what they betokened was terror. As I crept further up the mast, the sail billowed out and away from me. The next moment the wind shifted and the great canvas collapsed, smashing its full weight against me, as though with a conscious mind to knock me from the rigging. Desperately I clung to the ropes with legs and arms, and then out the sail snapped. The ensuing vacuum all but sucked me off. God knows how, but I held on, and I continued up. I heard, threaded through the wailing wind, a ghastly shrieking sound. Then a tremendous splintering of wood. Could it, I wondered, be my mast? Was I about to be hurled into the waves? I dared not stop and think, but the mast held. Hand over hand, foot after foot, I struggled upward. I was certain we were all about to die, whether above the waves or beneath them. It hardly seemed to matter. All I wanted was to reach that sail, as if by doing so I could rise above the chaos. To cut that sail free was my only purpose. I would not and could not think of anything else. Sometimes I paused just to hang on, to gasp for breath, to remind myself that I lived. But then, once again, I continued up. It felt like hours. It probably took minutes. At last, I reached my goal. The foreyard is one of the biggest sails, one of a sailing ship's true engines. But even though it worked hard for the ship under normal circumstances, in this storm it strained against her, as if trying to support the mast from the deck, to uproot the mast. Despite the roaring wind that beat about me, I could hear the creaking of the mast, could see it bend like a great bow. What I needed to do, and had to do, was cut that sail free and release the terrible strain upon the mast. Fearful of wasting any time, I simply straddled the spar to which the sail's top edge was lashed and backed out toward its end, hacking away at each piece of rope as I came upon it. Fortunately, the lines were so tight and the blades so sharp, I hardly had to cut. The moment I touched a rope with the knife's edge, strands flew apart as if exploding. With each rope, I cut the sail, blew out more freely. Flapping in such frenzy, it began to shred into tiny strands that I could no longer distinguish from the streaking rain. Bit by bit, I moved along, cutting as I went, until I reached the spar's furthest end. There I had to make another decision. Should I cut the lines that held the spar itself? What would happen if I did so? If I did not? I looked about in the vain hope that another one of the crew might be near. To my surprise, I did see a shadowy form of someone above, but who it was I couldn't tell. In any case, he was climbing further up the mast than I. I decided not to cut more lines. Someone else could do it if that's what needed to be done. My job was to cut away the rest of the sail, which meant going back the way I'd come and proceeding out along the spar toward the opposite end. The spar, however, with its lopsided weight and me at one end, was swinging and lurching about so wildly I feared it might break free and drop with me on it. I had to get back to the mast. But the foot ropes were gone. In my wild hacking, I'd cut them free too. I would have to drag myself along, with the knife clamped between my teeth, arms tightly locked around the spar. I flung myself down and tried to slide forward. But at the next lurch of the spar, my legs slipped away, and the knife fell from my mouth. In a small part of a second, I was now dangling, legs down, facing away from the mast, about to drop into the wildest scene imaginable. I had no choice. I had to clamber hand over hand backward towards the mast. But as much as I tried for speed, I could move only in tiny increments. The wind and rain, as well as the tossing motion of the ship, kept impeding me. I was dangling in the hurricane winds, twisting. Over my shoulder, I could see that the mast was not far out of reach. But then my arms began to cramp. "Help!" I screamed. "Help me!" One hand lost its grip. 4 feet from the mast, I tried to swing myself back in a vain hope of grasping the mast with my legs. The attempt only weakened my hold more. I was certain I was going to drop. "Help!" I screamed into the wind. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the spar. "Charlotte," I heard, "take my hand." And indeed, a hand was thrust toward my face. I reached for it frantically, grabbed it, clung to it as it clung to me, its fingers encircling my wrist in an iron grip. For a moment I was hanging by that one hand. Then I was yanked upward onto the spar so I could get my legs around it and locked. Gasping for breath, I glanced up at the figure who was now scrambling away. It was Zachariah. For one brief moment I was certain that I died and he was an angel. But I hardly had time for thought. For just above me, I heard the great wrenching explosion. I looked up to see the foreyard had ripped away. As the sail spun off in the wind, I caught a glimpse of its gray mass, twisting and turning into oblivion, like a tormented soul cast down to hell. I spun back around. The man I thought to be Zachariah had vanished. But even as I gazed in wonder, the Seahawk, free from the sail's pull and weight, heeled violently. To my horror, I saw the ocean rush up toward me. We were capsizing. But then suddenly the ship shivered and righted herself. Gasping for breath, I clawed my way forward until I reached the mast, which I hugged as though it was life itself. Without the knife, there was nothing more that I could do aloft. In any case, the sail I had been sent to free was gone. I began to descend, slipping more than I climbed. I jumped the last few feet onto the deck. I don't know if the storm had somehow abated or I'd just grown used to it. There were still strong winds, and the rain beat upon us as before, but the fury of the hurricane somehow softened. I looked about. Spars, some tangled with sails, lay in heaps. Railings were splintered. Dangling ropes flapped about. And then I saw some of the men on the quarterdeck working frantically with axes. I hurried to join them. Only then did I realize the mainmast was gone. All that remained was a jagged stump. I thought of the shriek I'd heard. Looking toward the stern, I saw Fisk slumped over the wheel. His great arms were spread wide, his hands clutching the wheel spokes. He could not have stayed upright had he not been lashed into place. In other words, Fisk was tied to the wheel so that he would not let loose of it. I joined the men. Beneath the continual, it now somewhat slackened downpour, we all pulled at the great mound of down spars and sails. Those that were dragging overboard we cut loose and let go. Those we could move we flung into the waist. And then, quite suddenly, as if heaven itself had triumphed over darkness, the rain ceased. The sea subsided into a roiling calm. Even the sun began to shine, and when I looked up, I saw to my astonishment blue sky. "It's over," I said breathlessly. Mr. Johnson shook his head. "Nothing like," he warned. "It's the eye of the storm. There'll only be a pause, and it'll be back in 20 minutes, going the other way. But God willing, if we can clear the deck, we may be able to ride it out." I looked up at our remaining mast. Only the topgallant was left. The other sails had been cut loose. Working frantically, we reached the bottom of the pile. It was Foley who pulled away the last torn sail. And there, beneath it, lay Mr. Hollybrass, face down. A knife was stuck in his back, plunged so deeply that only the handle could be seen. I recognized the design of a star. This was the dirk that Zachariah had given me. The sight of the dead Mr. Hollybrass, for it was certain that was the case, left us all dumbfounded. But after all we'd been through in the storm, it's hardly to be wondered that we made no response. We were too drained and too numb. "What is it?" came a voice. We turned to see Captain Jaggery. He was looking much like the rest of us, wild and disheveled. We stepped aside. No one said a word. He came forward. For a moment he too did nothing but stare at the body. Then he knelt and touched the man's face and the back of his neck. For a moment he hesitated, and then pulled Mr. Hollybrass's arm from where it lay twisted under his body. The dead man clutched something in his hand. The captain managed to pry the fingers open and plucked away what Mr. Hollybrass had been holding. He held it up. It was my handkerchief. The captain now used the handkerchief to grasp the handle of the knife and pull it from the dead man's back. He stood up. He was looking directly at me. At last he turned toward the sky. It was darkening again, and the sea began to heave in growing swells. "We shall have 15 more minutes before the storm returns," he announced. "I want this body removed and placed in steerage. In the available time, the rest of you clear the deck. Mr. Johnson's watch shall man the pumps first. 2 from Mr. Hollybrass's watch will hold the wheel, and the rest can stay in the forecastle. I will call the rotation. Now, quickly!" The captain's orders were carried out in silence. Dillingham and Grimes took Mr. Hollybrass's body below. The rest of us roamed the decks alone or in pairs, flinging broken bits of mast, sail, and spar into the sea, or trying to tie down what was possible to save by lashing it on deck. I followed along, doing what I could, my mind a jumble. Not a word was spoken regarding Mr. Hollybrass or his death. As extraordinary as the event was, there was no time, no mind to consider it. As predicted, the storm struck within the quarter hour, and with as much fury as before. But the Sea Hawk, with one mast and but a single sail hung, was more fit to ride it out. I rushed to the top cargo where the pumps were. They were simple suction pumps, and each capable of being worked by as few as 2. Before we were Grimes, Keach, Mr. Johnson, and myself, who heaved the handles in the cold and wet, lurching darkness, as though our lives depended upon it, which they did. Again the Sea Hawk began a mere toy to the elements. Wind shrieked and howled. More than once water poured over us from above, or the ship heeled to the gunwales, bringing hearts to mouths. For the merest second we would balance on the brink of capsizing, while we pumped with greater will than ever. It was as if the rhythmic action was the true beating of our own hearts. As if we were to stop for more than a moment, the heart of the ship might cease beating too. To work meant to live, and work we did for upward of 3 hours. Then we were released. I was sent to the forecastle to rest along with Morgan, Barlow, and Fisk. Morgan searched for his tobacco pouch, but most personal belongings were flung about and broken, and those still whole were soaking wet. He swore in frustration. "Be glad you're breathing air, lad," Fisk said wearily. Chilled to the bone, exhausted, I tumbled into a hammock and tried to sleep. But I'd hardly closed my eyes before I was called out again. Now I was to stand to the wheel. The captain was there. To his credit, he remained at the helm throughout the storm, calling upon us to attempt this judgment, or that, anything to keep our stern toward the wind. Barlow, my partner, did most of the work. Great strength was wanted just to hold the wheel steady. Whatever strength I had was fast ebbing. I was frozen, miserable. It did not matter. From duty at the wheel I returned to the pumps, and from the pumps to the forecastle. Thence again to the wheel, round and again, perhaps 3 times in all. I lost count. At last, some 17 hours after we first been called out, the storm abated. I was allowed to return to my hammock, where, spent and shivering, I closed my eyes. On the edge of sleep, I suddenly recalled the visitation of Zachariah and the demise of Mr. Hollybrass. This thought of the dead served to remind me that I was still alive, and that consolation eased my body and calmed my mind. Within seconds, I slept the sleep of the dead who wait, with perfect equanimity, upon the final judgment. Charlotte Doyle, Chapter 16. It was 14 hours before I woke. If I'd known that much time had passed, I'd have realized something was amiss. No matter what the circumstances, it's irregular for any member of a crew to be allowed to sleep so long. For the moment, however, I remained in my hammock, blithely assuming it was simply not yet time for my normal watch. The canvas curtain had been restrung and was drawn closed. But that was the type of kindness that Barlow or Ewing would have done. The familiar sounds of the running ship comforted me, and the truth is, despite the fact that my shirt and trousers were still damp, my body one great ache, I was enjoying my rest, thanking God and Zachariah I was alive. Suddenly I sat up, but Zachariah died. I had seen him beaten to death and committed to the sea. Was it his ghost that had saved me? I remembered thinking of an angel. Had I hallucinated the moment, made a story of it for myself? It was like the kind of forecastle yarn I'd heard the sailors tell so often, and I had not believed them, not then. And yet, what was I to think other than a miracle had transpired? That, I told myself, was absurd. But I had not imagined it. I remembered the man's iron grip. Someone had helped me. Someone other than Zachariah. It had to be, but who? I reached for my hammock and drew back the canvas curtain. I was alone. Puzzled, I got up quickly and ran from the forecastle onto the deck. What I saw was a perfect sky as any deep-water sailor could wish. The sun was warm, the breeze out of the west strong and even. And the deck was in good order, as if the storm had been but a dream. Even the foremast and bowsprit were fully rigged, their sails taut. Only the jagged stump of the main mast on the quarter deck stood testimony to the last 24 hours. How much the men had accomplished while I slept. I felt forgotten. There was Barlow and there was Morgan, Foley. It was my watch to be on duty, but why hadn't I been called? And then I realized that both watches were on deck. When I saw Ewing and Keach working near at hand, I went to them. "Ewing! Keach!" Both men turned about. Instead of giving me the regular casual greeting, "Mornin' to you, lass," Ewing stopped his work and gaped at me with a frown that signaled I knew not what. It gave me sudden pause. I glanced at Keach, whose pinched face bore his familiar rabbit look of fear. But like Ewing, he said nothing. "Why wasn't I called?" I asked. "Called?" Ewing echoed dumbly. "My watch." They offered no explanation. "Answer me!" Ewing sighed. "Charlotte, we were told not to." "Told? Who told you?" "It's not for us to say, miss," Keach whispered. "You're not to call me miss," I cried out in exasperation. "Are you going to tell me or not?" Ewing looked at me reluctantly. It's Hollybrass, his murder." I had put that completely out of my mind. "Well, what's that got to do with not calling me?" I demanded, drawing closer. Ewing sprang up and backed away, as if frightened. I turned to Keach, but he seemed suddenly absorbed in his work. "Something else has happened, hasn't it?" I said, more and more apprehensive. "What is it?" "It's the captain, miss," Keach began. "Charlotte!" I broke in angrily. Keach drew a hand across his mouth as if to stop it. "What has happened?" I persisted. "Are you going to tell me or not? Is it some secret?" Ewing licked his lips. Keach seemed to be avoiding my eyes. But it was he who said, "The captain told us, when he was committing Hollybrass to the sea, that—" Now his darting eyes flicked toward me, and then away. "It was you that murdered him." My breath all but failed. "Me?" I managed to get out. "Aye, you." "Who could believe such a thing?" I exclaimed. "How? Why?" "To avenge Zachariah's death," Ewing whispered. I stood there open-mouthed. "But Zachariah—" I began, not even sure what I was going to say. The former second mate looked around at me, his eyes narrowed. "What about Zachariah?" he asked, standing up. "He's dead," I said lamely. "He's all of that," Ewing agreed. Keach began to move away quickly. Ewing started to follow. I grabbed his arm. "Ewing," I said, "do you think I did it?" He shook his arm free. Captain says that dirk was yours. Ewing, I left that dirk in my old cabin. That's what the captain said you'd say. I took in his meaning. You believe him, don't you? He studied his hand. And the others? I wanted to know. You'll have to ask them. Deeply shaken, I started for the galley in search of Fisk, but changed my mind. It was Captain Jaggery I had to see. I turned and headed for his cabin, but before I had taken 5 steps, I was confronted by the captain himself coming to the quarterdeck. I stopped in surprise. The man before me was not the same Captain Andrew Jaggery I'd seen on the quarterdeck the first day we sailed. True, he still wore his fine clothes, but the jacket was soiled and showed any number of rips. A cuff was frayed, a button gone. Small points, perhaps, but not for a man of his fastidiousness. And the whip mark, though no longer so pronounced, had become a thin white line, like a persistent, painful memory. "Miss Doyle," the captain proclaimed for all to hear, "I charge you in the willful murder of Mr. Hollybrass." I turned to appeal to the crew, only recently my comrades, who stood looking on. "I didn't do it," I said. "Have no fear, Miss Doyle. You'll have a jury of your peers and a speedy trial." "It's a lie," I said. "Mr. Barlow," the captain called, never for a moment turning his cold eyes from me. Barlow shuffled forward. "Take the prisoner to the brig," the captain said, offering a key that Barlow took. "Miss Doyle, your trial for murder will commence at the first bell of the first dog watch today." "Come along, miss," Barlow whispered. I shrank back. "Easy, Charlotte," he went on. "I'll do you no harm." His words reassured me somewhat, but no other words of comfort came. The central hatch cover was slid back. Barlow beckoned me to it, and under the eyes of all he followed me down the ladder. We passed by the top cargo, where Barlow lit a lantern, and then groped our way into the hold, the bottom of the ship. I had avoided even thinking of the place since the incident of the false head. As far as I could see, which was not very far, it was like some long-forgotten tunnel dwelling, faced with great wood timbers and rough planking grown corrupt with green slime. The area was crammed with barrels and cases, among which only a narrow passageway of planking had been left. Barlow led me forward as the blackened bilge lapped below. The stench was loathsome. A few feet ahead I saw the brig, not so much a room as a cage of iron bars with a gate for a door. I could make out a stool for sitting, a pan for slops. Nothing more. Had Cranach, the poor man, been its last inhabitant? Barlow unlocked the rusty padlock on the gate. It took a yanking to free it. "You'll want to go in," he said. I hesitated. "You'll leave the light, won't you?" I asked. Barlow shook his head. "If it tumbled, we'd have a fire." "But it'll be completely dark." He shrugged. I stepped inside. Barlow closed the gate and locked it. For a moment I just stood helplessly, watching him move away. Suddenly frightened, I called, "Barlow!" He paused to peer back over his shoulder. "Do you think I killed Mr. Hollybrass?" He considered for a moment. "I don't know, Charlotte," he said wearily. "Well, you must think someone did," I cried, wanting to hold him there as much as I wanted answers. "I don't know as I allow myself to think," he offered, and made hastily for the ladder. Utterly discouraged, I remained standing in the dark. All about me I heard the hollow groans of the ship, the cargo creaking, water dripping and sloshing and rustling, a sudden squeaking of rats. Nearly sick with fright, I felt about for the stool. I sank upon it, reminding myself that I wouldn't have to stay for long. Captain Jaggery had promised a trial that very day. But what kind of trial? Zachariah's words filled my head, that a captain is the sheriff, the judge, and the jury. And the hangman, too. Shivering, I bent over and hugged myself to my knees. Without the crew on my side, I would be hard put to prove my innocence. I knew that. Yet they seemed to have turned against me. Of all misfortunes, that was the most hurtful to bear. I shifted the stool so I could lean back against the rear bars of the brig and close my eyes against the dark. I ran my fingers through my hair, but the gesture only reminded me that I'd hacked it short. For a brief moment I caught a distant vision of myself as I had been before the Seahawk, before this tumultuous voyage. Was it days or years that had passed since? I was speculating thus when I heard a different kind of noise. At first I ignored it, but when it came again, a slow, hesitant sound, almost like a human step, I opened my eyes wide and stared into the dark. Was this my imagination too? The sound grew closer. My heart began to pound. "Who's there?" I called out. After a moment I heard, "Charlotte, is that you?" I leaped to my feet. "Who is it?" I cried. By way of answering, the shuffling drew closer, and then suddenly stopped. Now I was certain I heard labored breathing. A spark burst forth, then a tiny light, and before me loomed the ancient head of Zachariah.